There we go. So I can definitely tell the temperature has dropped. I'm officially cold, and that's okay. It's when you just gotta embrace the suck and keep on a-pushing. Punchbook.
Welcome back to Jarhead Jed, where adventure is always just around the corner. This is the final part of this ride. By this point, I'm coming out of Hot Springs, heading down River Road, and eventually through Paint Creek Corridor. The temperature is still dropping, the rain hasn't stopped. If anything, it's gotten heavier in spots, mixing now with sleet and wet snow just enough to remind you winter isn't far off. And honestly, I'm tired. Not in some dramatic way, just that steady kind of tired that settles in after you've been cold and wet long enough. The kind where your gloves never really dry out. Your boots gave up hours ago, and you've stopped asking yourself if you're uncomfortable because you already know the answer. But somewhere in the middle of all that, I realized something. This ride stopped being about the ride a while ago. And now, heading home, I found myself thinking less about the weather and more about what this whole thing actually was. Why choose the rain? Why willingly step into something difficult when comfort is always sitting there as an option? And maybe more importantly, what do you bring back with you after it's over? There's something strange about leaving the mountain after a ride like this. Not because the scenery changes dramatically. It doesn't. The mountains are still there. The rivers are still moving. The fog still hangs low over everything like it belongs there. But mentally, something shifts. Somewhere coming out of Hot Springs, the road changes. The gravel disappears, the bike settles into the tarmac, and after hours of riding loose surfaces, mud, rain, and rock, you feel it immediately. Everything smooths out. The sound changes. Even the way the Triumph Tiger moves underneath you changes. And as simple as that sounds, it felt like more than just pavement. It felt like I was slowly re-entering the world again. Back towards structure. Back towards routine. Back toward all the noise that fills everyday life. And honestly, part of me didn't want that yet. Because out there, stripped down in the cold and rain, things have become very simple. Not easy, but simple. Keep moving. Pay attention. Stay steady. That was it. And somewhere along the way I realized how much of life is cluttered with things that don't really matter. Not evil things, not terrible things, just noise, distractions, comforts, conveniences. Things that slowly pull your attention away from what's real. And when you spend enough time away from it all of that, you start noticing it differently. That's one thing rides like this do. They clear things out. Not in some mystical way. You're not finding yourself out in the mountains like some Instagram quote. You're just removing enough distractions to finally hear your own thoughts again. And I think a lot of people are more uncomfortable with that than they are with the cold. Because silence has a way of forcing honesty. When there's nothing to distract you, nowhere to hide your attention, you start seeing things clearly. Your habits, your mindset, the ways you drift towards comfort without even realizing it. And if I'm being honest, that's probably one of the biggest reasons I do this. Because comfort has never made me better. It's made me softer. Not weak physically, just complacent. You stop pushing yourself. You stop paying attention. You stop testing your limits. And after a while, you start needing perfect conditions just to function well. I never wanted to become dependent on comfort. And I think that's why rides like this matter to me. Not because I enjoy suffering. I really don't. There's nothing enjoyable about cold rain soaking through your gear while your fingers slowly stop wanting to cooperate. There's nothing enjoyable about knowing if you wreck in these conditions, hypothermia becomes a real concern real quick. And that thought was there the entire ride, especially through Hurricane Gap. No service, very few people, temperatures dropping, rain turning over to sleet. You become very aware, very quickly, that nature doesn't care about your plans. And honestly, I think there's something healthy about remembering that. Because modern life does a pretty good job of convincing us we're more in control than we really are. Climate control, instant communication, GPS, comfort everywhere. We've insulated ourselves from almost every form of discomfort imaginable. And while there's nothing wrong with technology, I do think there's a danger in forgetting how fragile we actually are. Out there, you remember, the mountain doesn't care how tough you think you are. The weather doesn't care what your plans were. And there's something grounded about that. It strips away ego pretty fast. You stop pretending, you stop performing, you just deal with reality as it is. And that's where something starts happening mentally. Jordan Peterson talks a lot about voluntarily carrying difficult burdens. One quote of his that always stuck with me was, "What you most need will be found where you least want to look." And I think there's truth in that, because most people avoid discomfort instinctively. We avoid difficult conversations, difficult situations, difficult truths, and over time, that avoidance shapes us. It makes us smaller, more fragile, less capable of handling hardship when it eventually finds us anyway. Because hardship always comes eventually. It's not optional. Life guarantees it. So maybe part of the reason I ride like this is because I'd rather meet hardship voluntarily sometimes. Not because I'm trying to prove something to anyone else. Nobody's out there watching me ride through freezing rain, especially on this YouTube channel. Most of y'all aren't subscribed. Now would be a great time to do so. Nobody cares. And honestly, that's part of why it matters. Because it forces honesty. You can't fake perseverance when nobody's watching. You either stay in it or you don't. And I think that's where character actually gets built. Not publicly, quietly. In moments where nobody would blame you for quitting. But you keep going anyway. There's a quote from Theodore Roosevelt that fits this perfectly. "Nothing in the world is worth having or worth doing unless it means effort, pain, difficulty." That's easy to agree with when things are comfortable. It's harder to believe when you're soaked through riding a motorcycle into sleet in the mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina. But that's exactly why it matters. Because principles only mean something when conditions get bad. Anybody can talk about perseverance. Anybody can admire discipline. But actually choosing discomfort when comfort is available, that's different. And I think that's why these rides become more than rides for me. They become reminders. Reminders that I'm capable of more than comfort tells me I am. Reminders that I don't need perfect conditions to move forward. Reminders that peace and comfort are not always the same thing. That's something I thought about a lot riding through Paint Creek. Because by then, the ride had changed emotionally. Earlier in the series, there was still this feeling of pushing into something unknown, but now it felt quieter, more reflective, like the mountain had already said what it needed to say, and now it was just a matter of whether or not I was listening. Paint Creek has a different feel to it in the weather like that. The river beside the road, fog hanging low through the trees, everything wet, gray, and cold, but beautiful in a way that's hard to explain unless you've seen it yourself. Not beautiful because it's comfortable, beautiful because it's real. In riding through it, I started thinking about how much perspective changes depending on the conditions. A clear sunny day in the mountains is beautiful, but there's something about fog, rain, and cold that strips the scenery down to its essentials. It feels older, wilder, almost untouched. And being fully immersed in that changes the way you see things. Not just around you, in you. There's a quote from Dostoevsky that kept floating through my mind. The mystery of human existence lies not in just staying alive, but in finding something to live for. And I think that's part of what people are chasing when they're willing to step into difficult things. Meaning, purpose. Something real enough to wake them up. Because modern life has a way of numbing people. Comfort can become a drug if you let it. Not because comfort itself is evil, but because too much comfort disconnects you from struggle. And struggle is where growth happens. Physically, mentally, and spiritually. And Scripture talks about that constantly. Romans 5:3-4 says, "And not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance, character, and character, hope." That verse used to confuse me a little when I was younger. Glory in tribulations? Who does that? Who willingly chooses difficulty? But I understand it differently now. It's not saying suffering itself is good. It's saying what suffering produces can be good. Perseverance, character, hope. Things that only exist because difficulty shaped them. And I think that's true whether you're talking spiritually or psychologically. Because hardship exposes things. It reveals weakness. It forces adaptation. It builds resilience. Not instantly, not dramatically, but slowly. And the more important part is this. You don't always realize it when it's happening. That's another thing rides like this taught me. Growth usually doesn't feel impressive in the moment. Most of the time, it just feels uncomfortable. Cold, tiring, inconvenient. But later you realize something changed. You react differently. You think differently. Carry yourself differently. And I think a lot of that comes from voluntarily stepping into situations that demand more from you. Not recklessly, not foolishly, but intentionally. There's a difference. I wasn't out here trying to prove I was invincible. Quite the opposite. That ride reminded me several times how vulnerable a person really is, especially alone in bad weather, especially cold and wet. And that awareness never really leaves. But instead of taking away from the experience, it actually sharpened it. Because danger has a way of making you present. You stop drifting mentally. You stop living half aware. Everything narrows down to what matters right now. The road, The weather, the bike, your decisions, and honestly, there's peace in that. Not comfort, peace. There's a difference. Comfort is external, peace, internal. And I think a lot of people confuse the two. You can become comfortable and miserable at the same time. People do it every day. But peace, real peace, usually shows up when everything unnecessary falls away. And that's exactly what happened out there. By the time I was riding through Paint Creek, I realized this whole ride had been stripping things down layer by layer. First, the comfort, then the distractions, then the noise, until eventually all that was left was what was actually mattered. Faith, perspective, discipline, and gratitude. And the realization that maybe we're stronger than we think we are when we stop avoiding difficult things. There's another verse that kept coming to mind riding through here. Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. And I know people usually think of that verse as peaceful, quiet, calm, but I didn't think stillness necessarily means comfort. Sometimes stillness is what happens when everything else gets stripped away and you finally start paying attention. And that's what the mountains felt like on that ride. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. And maybe that's the best way I can explain this whole series. Honestly. The mountains are honest. The weather is honest. Cold rain is honest. There's no pretending in it. And I think that's why I kept coming back to rides like this. Not because I enjoy misery, but because I trust reality more than comfort. I trust difficult things to teach me more than easy things. And I think somewhere deep down, most men understand that instinctively. It's why people seek challenge, why they climb mountains, why they train hard, why they push themselves physically and mentally. Not because suffering itself is noble, but because overcoming something changes you. And maybe that's the real answer to the question this whole series started with. Why choose the rain? Because rain changes the ride. And difficult things change people. Eventually the miles started running out. The mountains slowly faded behind me. The roads became more familiar, more ordinary. And I remember thinking something that surprised me a little. Part of me didn't want the ride to end. Not because I wanted to stay cold and soaked forever, but because I knew that what was waiting on the other side. Noise, routine, distraction, normal life. And none of those things are bad. That's real life too. But it's easier to lose perspective there. Easier to drift. Easier to forget what matters. And I think that's the real challenge now. Not surviving the ride, not enduring the weather, but carrying what I found out there back with me after it's over. Because eventually, every ride ends. You head home. You pull into the driveway. You take off the wet gear. The bike cools down in the garage. And life keeps moving. But if you're lucky, you bring something back with you. Something steady, something honest, and something real. And maybe that's enough reason to choose the rain.